Your impression about this session of the mechanism on indigenous people?
Yes, well, I think this is an important session because of the study that they're doing, the study on Indigenous people's right to decision making. The progress report they gave last year was very good, and this report this year is very important as well. So this is a big issue for us, and we're hoping that the expert mechanism will continue to focus on this matter along with implementation of the declaration. So yeah, it's been a very interesting year for us, and we're hoping that at the end of the week we'll be coming up with some strong recommendations about future work.
And you think that after the adoption of the declaration, things are really changing for indigenous peoples?
I think there's plenty of evidence that changes are occurring. Probably not as fast as we would like, but nevertheless there are real changes that are happening. I think that the biggest risk we have at the moment is that governments try to downplay the importance of the declaration, that they make some changes but not to the extent that they should do. So what we'll need to do now as Indigenous peoples from around the world just push a lot harder to say that this is a standard that should be regarded as a minimum to be implemented in the governments, and that they should make a great effort to particularly revise their laws and, if need be, their constitution to ensure that historical and systemic problems for Indigenous peoples are being looked at and removed so that all the rights that are in the declaration can be enjoyed.
And for your community in Australia, something is changed about after the declaration?
We haven't seen change on the ground in the communities, and this is always our biggest concern, that we need to see real change. But what we're doing now is we're actually into much better discussions with the government. The government is listening, and we are closer in the way that we're negotiating on these sorts of things. So we think that change is there and that we'll see it happening over the next year or two. But what's most important about the change is it's change that's being driven with the either by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or with the support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the sort of change that's going to occur, I think, is going to be very good.
And you work for many years in the United Nations for Indigenous people for over the world. What kind of personal experience have given to you this contact with all the communities of the planet?
Well, always I think what we find is that the experience of Indigenous peoples around the world is very much the same. Even though there's a great diversity in cultures and worldviews, the experiences are the same. It involves the threat to the territories, it involves historical disadvantage, it involves very great social marginalisation, particularly lack of political power within the workings of the state, and no opportunity for development, economic, social or cultural development with these communities. I know that there's a number of delegations here who are concerned about identity of Indigenous peoples, that the states are not accepting that there are Indigenous populations living in their territories, or are trying to say that Indigenous populations don't have any particular rights from other populations. But to me, that is a situation that will resolve itself with time. The real issue is about ensuring that, and hopefully it's not just Indigenous peoples that benefit. If there are other marginalised communities and so on, or minorities and so on, that they will also benefit by the governments having to give greater attention to human rights. The other situation around the world, I think, is about governments not being fully aware and informed about what the declaration is and what it contains. So while we're here in the United Nations and we have ambassador staff that are here, they understand much better the human rights issues at question. But when you go into the countries around the world, the parliamentarians and the civil servants do not understand it. A lot of them have not even heard of the declaration, and that's where a lot of work has to be done on the part of governments. The other major thing for governments is the systemic problems, that the way that departments or institutions are structured, just in the way that they work, can be to the disadvantage of Indigenous peoples, because this was the way they were set up from the beginning. And so even though if you might look for equality in laws, equality in policies, the mechanics of the way in which the system works is very much against Indigenous peoples. The other big influence, the negative influence we've got to address, is the impact of financial sector, that there are global financial organisations, transnational corporations and so on, who are used to go into other territories and extracting profits from resources that are in those territories. They also don't readily come along to implement the declaration, and can be a lot of pressure upon governments not to change as well. So we have to take that into account. And final thing I will say is that for Indigenous peoples themselves, we are so used to being the victims and so used to being marginalised and kept oppressed that it's hard for us to take the step forward to start looking after our future and our affairs and to be assertive about that. And that's one of the things we're trying to get the message out to Indigenous peoples everywhere, is that the implementation of the declaration will ultimately rely upon the people coming forward and saying, we want self-determination and this is how we're going to exercise self-determination. If they don't do that, self-determination will not come to their door. They have to go forward and assert it.
You think that traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples is enough taken in consideration to the United Nations?
It's been a problem in the general area. This year and last year we've seen two international treaties being developed to deal with traditional knowledge. And while these are meant to protect traditional knowledge in international trade so that people's copyrights and people's designs and ceremonies and so on are not being taken from them, it can also be a great inhibition upon Indigenous peoples and control over their traditional knowledge. So this is a problem we have at the moment. We feel that bodies like the Secretariat of the Convention on Biodiversity and the World Intellectual Property Organisation, who are behind these international treaties, don't understand their obligations in human rights, and that they have to ensure that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is implemented in these treaties that they've got there. So that's been a big task for us at the moment. Unfortunately, this is a very legalistic, and Indigenous communities themselves are not aware of what is happening, and a lot of the Indigenous peoples around the world are not successfully participating in the process. So it's only been a few people who've been going along to the meetings, who've been trying to get a voice and try and get states to observe human rights, but it is a problem for us at the moment, and we're trying to put more pressure onto these organisations.
Next steps, what United Nations, do you think, what is the next step for Indigenous people?
Well, at the domestic level, I already said Indigenous peoples have to come forward and start to show to the government what models do they want for exercise their self-determination. They've got to assert themselves, and they've got to show the government what institutions that they have are going to be respected by the government. Also, I think that we have to keep on pressure on at the international level, particularly to ensure that there's monitoring and reviewing of what's going on in the various countries themselves, that we can't just leave the governments to be complacent about what they do. The United Nations has to be constantly asking the question, what have you done in the last few years to implement the Declaration, what aspects of the Declaration are being implemented, and so on. So at the international level, the United Nations has got to be vigilant and alert. We have to convince the state governments or the state members of the United Nations that they need to be continuing to focus on this. It didn't stop when they adopted the Declaration. It still has to be a lot of work to overcome what I have mentioned before, the historical reticence, the historical injustices have to be addressed. Governments can't just think that everything's okay now that they've passed the document.
Thank you very much, Les.